going to drink. How hungry are you?
All right. Hello, everyone. I see a bunch of you are starting to tune in now. If you can hear me, why don't you go ahead and give me a thumbs up in the chat? Awesome. See a bunch of hand raises, some thumbs up. Perfect. And we're going to go ahead and just give another minute or two for everyone who's starting to log in here. Feel free to introduce yourself inside the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to get to know you a little bit. I just want to introduce myself a little bit. My name is Lauren Kanzaki. I am a rising second-year medical student at The Ohio State University College of Medicine. I'm super excited to do this boot camp with you all. This is my third time doing it. I was not too long ago in your shoes as a participant, and this helped me loads in my application process. and eventually I think really helped me set myself up to get into medical school. So I think you guys are in for a really huge treat. Go ahead and feel free to leave any comments inside of the chat. And then also go ahead and put any questions you have inside the Q&A, and we'll probably get to them towards the end of the webinar here. Perfect. To see we have people from all over. Glad to see it. So thanks again for joining us. And for those of you who are not familiar with diverse medicine, I kind of just wanted to give a little brief intro for you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here with you all. And so what you're going to see here is the homepage for Diverse Medicine. And Diverse Medicine is a free resource for you guys to make an account and connect with others inside of the field. There's going to be other pre-medical students, medical student, also some physicians and some other allied health professional on the site. And what you can see here is you go ahead and create your profile here. And this is what it looks like on the dashboard. You'll see just posts from everyone here. We have a bunch of blogs on here. We have this awesome resource here, which is pretty new. I'm gonna go ahead and show it to you all. I'm clicking on the side here to our Mentor Center. And if you're someone who's like me, you were kind of looking for some extra help, you wanted a mentor, someone to bounce some ideas off of, go ahead and look through this. I highly recommend it. You can go ahead and search through it just this way, or you can even sort it by level of education. So once you set it through this mode, you will start to see resident physicians, and then you'll come across medical students, other pre-meds, or those who are in graduate school. So there's really a huge diverse range of mentors that we have on the site. And I know all of you are tuning in for application bootcamp. So you guys are all maybe getting ready to apply or starting to think about it within these next couple years. So we do also have a bunch of other resources for you all. We do have services for application help. So this is the pre-health market. And go ahead and look through this at your own time. If you have any questions, go ahead and feel to post inside the Q&A, and I'll answer those during the webinar here. But basically what you can do is go ahead and look at our pre-medical resources. We have work and activities review. We go ahead and review personal statements and do mock interviews for you all. So we really just want to give you really affordable resources to help get you into medical school. And so that's what I have to show for Diverse Medicine. If you do not have an account, I highly recommend you make one. And I can show you one other little feature that I really loved when I was applying to medical school. So here I'm going to my profile, and you can see on my profile here, as it loads. Your profile is basically kind of like a LinkedIn, but all for your pre-med activities. So what you can see here is you can go ahead and list different activities with different categories, clubs and organizations. There's volunteer activities, clinical experiences, and you go ahead and log all those, and it gives you the ability to put in the amount of hours that you have done, and also a brief explanation of each of those. So what I did is I used this as a way to keep track of my pre-med activities throughout the years, and then also start to prep on what I would do in terms of my discussion for what I wanted to put into my medical school work and activity section. So this kind of gives you a nice platform where everything is all together. And then that way, once you are ready to start filling out your application, you're just transferring it. You don't have to go back and think about all the little things you did. Try and make sure you don't miss anything. So that's something that I found super helpful when I was applying. And like I said before, this is our boot camp put on with SNMA. So we do have Miss Nicole Davis here. She is the SNMA pre-med representative. I want to go ahead and introduce her and have her come speak to you a little bit about what SNMA is. So Nicole, if you would like to speak with our audience, please go ahead.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Awesome. Sorry, I'm trying to start my video, but it's not letting me do it. Well, anyway, my name is Nicole Davis. I'm the National Pre-Medical Board Member to the Student National Medical Association. I just wanted to thank you all so much on behalf of SNMA for being here, for participating in Application Bootcamp yet another year. This is our 4th annual one. So this webinar, we're going to be talking about AMCAS and COVID. There are a lot of questions surrounding how all of these kind of like COVID precautions and everything are going to affect the way that the application cycle goes this year, the MCAT, everything like that. So just wanted to thank you all so much, and to thank our speaker, Dr. Conwell, who is working with the Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine, who was so gracious to come and speak to us today. So that's pretty much all I had. Just thank you, and take it all in and enjoy it. Thank you for everything.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for joining, Nicole. And just like she said, we do have a very special guest on today to come and talk to you guys a little bit about the AMCAS application and also some of the details surrounding COVID and what you guys can expect. And this is a really great time for you guys to get some special questions answered. So go ahead and make sure you utilize this time. We do have a dean here. We have Dr. Walter Conwell, who's the Dean of Diversity at Kaiser Permanente. So this is so exciting for us. Kaiser Permanente is a new school. We would love for you guys to hear about it and also hear from someone who is on the other side of the application process. So if you have any questions about your timeline, AMCAS timeline, how things are changing with COVID, go ahead and put those into the Q&A and we'll make sure we get those answered. So Dr. Conwell, if you'd like to come on and introduce yourself, we would love to have you join us now.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I'm also trying to share my video and unable to do so, but I will go ahead and share my screen. And I just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. Is that true?
Yes,
right, so,
we can see your screen.
Okay, wonderful. So hello, everyone. My name is Walter Conwell. I'm the Associate Dean for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity for the Kaiser Permanente Bernard J. Tyson School of Medicine. I'm also a practicing pulmonary, critical care, and sleep medicine physician with the Southern California Permanente Medical Group. I'm going to talk with you today about preparing for the medical school application cycle in general, but definitely during the critical times that we're in. I will say that things are ever in flux. Meaning that I will share with you information definitely from the KP's standpoint, and we have been in conversations with other local schools or neighboring schools, particularly in California, so I can give you some insight there. But across the country, we are all dealing with this together. So I think that one of the most important pieces of advice I can give is really to stay in contact with the schools that you're interested in applying to. But then as I go through the presentation, I'm going to give you different resources, many of which are from the AAMC, which will be of help to you. And I definitely encourage you to go to those resources, and specifically to the AAMC website very often to make sure that you're staying abreast of the changes that are ongoing. So our learning objectives over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes would be to ultimately help you to be able to discuss the intersection of your metrics, your attributes, and your experiences within your medical school application. I also, as I alluded to, want for you to be able to understand the mission of the Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine, our commitment to equity, inclusion, and diversity, and in alignment with that, the modifications and changes we'll be making in light of COVID-19 or the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, even though I represent one medical school, I always like to start off by saying that my goal, my job is to get you into medical school, meaning that as I go through this, I'm going to actually, to the best of my ability, talk to you about this process generally or more broadly. If some of you apply to the KP School of Medicine, that's fantastic. If some of you ultimately attend, that's even better. But I think this pandemic has shown that we need more physicians and more diverse physicians in general, regardless of the medical school that you go to. We need you in medicine. And I would say that the mission of not just the Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine and Kaiser Permanente writ large, but also SMMA and diverse medicine is to achieve that goal. So again, we are here to help you to be of support. And in alignment with that, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the admissions process in general. And one resource that I really encourage you to utilize is the MSAR resource, so the Medical School Admission Requirements resource published by the WMC every year. So this resource, as you're applying to medical school, really becomes your Bible for the med school application process. Specifically, it tells you a lot about the individual schools that you are interested in. And the reason why that's important is every school, every medical school will choose and develop admissions processes which align to their mission, vision, and values. And that's in alignment with what we call holistic review. And almost all medical schools use holistic review in some way, shape, or form based on one previous survey. And holistic review is a mission-aligned selection process, which takes into consideration all the things beyond just your numbers. So it takes into consideration your attributes and your experiences, and does so in a way that aligns with the mission of the school. Now, why might that be important? Well, if the mission of a school is to produce more biomedical researchers, they need to design a process to meet that mission, because every school wants to achieve its mission. But then also from a legal standpoint, it's important that the admissions process is aligned with the mission, because if it's not, that places the school at risk for lawsuit, to be perfectly honest. And if you've heard of any medical school, or really even any undergraduate institution that has been sued or gotten into legal trouble because of its admissions process, it's likely because of this, because there is a question or concern that their admissions process doesn't align with the mission. So if you then want to understand what the admissions process is, you learn more about the mission, and that gives you some insight into the process. So again, that's where the MSAR resource comes into play. So as you learn more about the individual schools and you learn about their mission and about their process, you will begin to appreciate that most schools are going to use this rubric or some variation of this rubric to design their admissions process and ultimately select their students. This rubric was developed by the WMC to push forward the holistic review or holistic process mission. Now, if you are looking though at this rubric and thinking to yourself, wow, that is super complicated. How would any school ever use this to select students? Well, I'll walk you through it. At the center of this rubric, you see excellence. And at the end of the day, that's what every medical school is looking for. They're looking for excellent pre-health or excellent applicants. I don't want to limit it to just pre-health students. They're looking for excellent applicants who will go on to become excellent students and ultimately become excellent physicians. But how do they determine who's excellent? Well, it's really these interlocking circles. They determine who's excellent based on the metrics. And specifically, when we think about the metrics, we definitely think about the MCAT, but it's more than just the total number, the sum of the scores. We are concerned about the subsections. And based on the individual school and its curriculum, the subsections may have more weight than others. So again, for one school, the car section might be the most important because of the curriculum that they have designed. They want to know that you have the ability to critically reason. For other schools, the biological sciences section might be most important because maybe they don't cover as much of that content in their first year or second year curriculum. So you can see that based on the school, not just the total score, but the individual section scores are important. But then schools are also interested in other things. They want to know how many times you had to take the MCAT. And the reason why that's important is every time you take the MCAT and don't achieve the score that you desire, there is a risk that the schools will factor in. Not an actual hard number, but in their minds. Because from one attempt to another, we would hope that you would have the self-awareness to reflect back on what you did and to seek out the resources that you might need in order to make adjustments. So if we see no significant change from one attempt to another, it actually is a red flag, not because of the score itself, but because of the question about self-awareness. or a question about the amount of energy or effort that you may have put in. So that's why it's important to take the MCAT when you are most prepared, when you're most ready. And then if you need to retake it, to make sure that you analyze what you did the first time and make adjustments. Now, in a second, I will get to the question of COVID-19 and how some schools are pivoting with regard to the MCAT in light of that. So just hold on and we'll come to that topic. But as far as other metrics, the GPA is important for sure, and you all knew that. And you may also know that specifically the science GPA is important. But you may not know that the grade trend is actually as important as the total number. So what do I mean by that? Well, for many students, particularly those who are first generation students or lower socioeconomic status students, as they transition into college or from community college into their four-year degree granting institution, they may struggle with that transition. And their GPA that first quarter, or maybe in even the first year, may not be what they would hope. But let's say they, through a process of self-awareness and reflection and through hard work and effort, they are able to make adjustments for their next quarter. And their GPA that quarter is better. Their sophomore year is even better. Junior year continues to improve, and they just kill it during their senior year. Well, by the end of their college career, their total GPA may be lower than they would hope, but their trend may be very positive. And that positive trend is a very good predictive factor for how those students may do in professional school, be it in medical school or otherwise. So that's why it's so vitally important to never give up. So everyone will be knocked down. Every undergrad student, every medical student, and definitely every resident and physician will be knocked down. But that's okay as long as you get back up. And what we want to see is that you have the resiliency to get back up. That if you struggle your first year or a life event happened and you tumbled during your sophomore year, that you got back up and you continue to strive forward. It's also why if you're a transfer student and if things didn't go well during community college, that you have another opportunity as you are in your four-year institution. Or if you get to the end of your college career and your GPA isn't what you would hope, that you take the steps to rectify that. And that's where post-bac programs come in. Now, I'm not going to take the time to go through this chart from Johns Hopkins. Again, this is also available, or something equivalent is available through the AAMC. But I show this to highlight that not every post-bac program is the same. And if you are interested in what step you should take, you really need to seek out your mentor, and particularly a mentor that has some knowledge about the different types of programs. So for instance, oftentimes students will say, okay, I want to get my GPA up, and I'm going to go out and get my MPH. Well, the MPH is laudable for sure, and will give you very helpful skills, but depending upon the structure of the program, it may not actually help you to reassure the med school admissions committee that you can handle rigorous coursework. You may do a lot of courses in statistics or courses in epidemiology, but for the med school admissions committee, they're going to be concerned about your ability to handle coursework that is more rigorous from a scientific standpoint, or from a basic science standpoint, I would say. So for that reason, you want to make sure that you understand what your needs are, and that you choose programs that will help you to meet those needs. So again, either way, we encourage you to not give up, to continue to strive forward, and to importantly get the resources and the help that you need to put yourself in the position where you can succeed. So those are the metrics that you may typically think about. So the MCAT and the GPA, but as I alluded to, is more than just the total MCAT or more than just the science GPA. The details are important. But more and more schools are using other metrics. So specifically professionalism metrics, such as the Casper situational judgment test, or the multi-mini interview. Now, normally when I give this talk, I kind of open it up and ask those in the audience what they've heard about these different metrics or tools. Obviously, we can't do that during this setting, but I would encourage you to go back and research these two tools more. Dozens of medical schools use the MMI, and many are starting to use the situational judgment test. So you should be aware and familiar before you apply to schools. As far as the situational judgment test, as the name implies, this is a test, actually an online test, that many schools may include as part of their secondary application. You pay a small fee, you log on, and you're given a number of scenarios that actually don't take a lot of biomedical knowledge to answer. But based on your response, you are then given a score relative to others who have taken that test during that application cycle. Now, the questions and the scenarios that you will be given are, again, as the name implies, focused on your ability to reason from a moral and ethical standpoint. Now, why would schools be interested in your moral, ethical reasoning ability? Well, it's because being a physician is more than answering a question right on the MCAT. It's more than knowing which molecule or which drug is important for a specific disease state. You have to navigate very difficult moral and ethical issues, not just in your patient interactions, but in your team interactions, etc. So schools want to know that they are selecting individuals that already have a good moral ethical framework. Similarly, the multi-mini interview, or the MMI, is a interview model that is very different from the traditional interview model, and is truly focused on understanding your reasoning ability. Now, the traditional interview model is one in which you might go to a medical school to interview, and you may interview with one person or maybe 2 or 3 people. They may choose to ask you structured interview questions or unstructured interview questions, either based on your application or blind to your application. But either way, it is still very subjective. So meaning, depending on how that interviewer felt that day, depending on whether or not they were hungry by the time they interviewed you, whether they were got a good night's rest, whether or not they were stressed, or if they just so happen to have a bias against some part of who you are, your evaluation may be very different. And if that's the one person or the 2 people you are interviewing with that day, those individuals really hold the keys to your ability to get into that medical school. So you can see the inherent problems with the traditional interview model and the biases and the subjective nature that it introduces. Now, conversely, the MMI, the best way to think of it is very similar to speed dating for medical school. So you would go up to a door. You would read a scenario outside of that door. That scenario, again, is one that would be very similar to the scenarios you might see during the situational judgment test. And oftentimes, those scenarios are based on the mission, vision, and values of the school. So again, that's why it's important to understand what the MVV of each school might be. And then after you read the scenario, you walk into the room and you have around 8 minutes to talk through that scenario with the individual that's sitting there. At the end of that, you walk out and you go on to another station. And you would have anywhere from 8 to 12 stations like that. Now, the beauty of the MMI is, one, is very structured, and the interviewers or the raters will usually have a rubric that they're using to grade you on relative to the other people who interviewed that day. But then also, even if you have a bad station, as long as you do well on the other stations, your chances of getting into that medical school are still very high. So you can see how the MMI is a much more equitable process than the traditional interview. So those are the metrics. Again, the traditional metrics that you may consider, as well as the professionalism metrics that many schools are using. But as you can see, again, from this rubric, it's more than just the metrics, because each one of those metrics that I just gave you have their own inherent biases. So many of us are aware of the biases which are present in standardized tests such as the MCAT. I alluded to earlier on how the GPA might be biased against those who are first generation students or lower socioeconomic status students. But even the MMI has its own inherent biases. Even though it tends to be less biased towards women, less biased towards those who are underrepresented in medicine, it can still be very biased against those who come from lower socioeconomic strata. It can also, interestingly enough, be biased against those who score higher on the MCAT. And more explicitly, we do find that those who score the highest on the MCAT tend to score lower on the MMI. Now, the point here being is there's no perfect test. Just like the tests we use in the hospital to diagnose different conditions, there is each test has its own attributes, and you have to understand the test and the attributes of the test, but then also the attributes of the individual who is taking the test. And that's where the other piece comes in. So meaning based on your on gender or based on your age, etc., we may find different scores in general for different tests. Now, this does not mean, to be very explicit, that schools have different cutoffs for different students. That is not the case, and actually it is illegal for students, for schools to have different cutoffs. But it means that context is important, and it's oftentimes said that context is key or context is king, meaning that it's impossible to understand anyone or anything outside of the context in which it was formed. So we need to understand your context, your attributes, to then understand your numbers. But it's yet and still more complicated than just that. And we actually also need to understand your experiences. And what I mean by that is there are no two people on the face of the planet who have exactly the same experiences. You can have the same metrics and the same attributes. You could be a 25-year-old Latinx woman who grew up in East LA and scored a 510 on the MCAT. But your life experiences might be very different from a 25-year-old Latinx woman who grew up in Miami and scored a 510 on the MCAT. Even within households, two identical twins might have very different life experiences. And those different life experiences create different neural pathways, and as a consequence, creates different people. So this is why the experiences are so vitally important to understand, again, your context, to put your attributes into context, and then put your metrics into context. And I will tell you that these experiences, I'm just gonna move forward a little bit, come in a lot of different flavors. Now, you might wonder when you apply to med school, why do they ask for all of these different experiences? Well, they tell us something about you, and they enhance your story and provide more context. Oftentimes, I will say medical students, or I'm sorry, medical school applicants have it in their minds that they need to check off a bunch of boxes on a checklist. Meaning that they know that medical schools are interested in research or scholarly activity, and they need to check that box off. They know they need to do some healthcare exposure, but they don't necessarily, they may not necessarily put additional thought into the types of experiences they choose. But the type of experience is as important as the experience itself, because the experience helps you to tell your story in a fuller way. So if we think about leadership experiences, for instance, it is true, most medical schools want to see some evidence of leadership. Why is that? Well, every physician will be a leader. They'll be a leader in their healthcare team, within their clinic, within their communities. And the best predictor of future performance is past performance, so we want to see some evidence of leadership. But within the leadership experience that you choose, you can tell your story. You can communicate your context, meaning that if you are passionate about pathway programs, such as the program that you're taking part in now, you can become a leader in that program, and that allows you to tell your story. If you are passionate about women's health issues, you can choose a scholarly project that allows you to tell that story. You could choose a basic science project focused on breast cancer. and on different hormonal receptors. You can choose a translational project focused on endometriosis and the impact that that may have on different populations. You can choose a clinical project focused on healthcare disparities in minority women. So if that is your interest and that's your passion, you can choose scholarly projects that still allow you to tell your story and enhance your individual context. So that's why the experiences are so important. As you think about building that into your application, you want to reflect upon what you learned from that experience and how did it change you. So what about you changed as a result of that experience? And what insights did you gain? So much of your application is about change. You know, it's about what happened to you, what did you choose to do, and how did that motivate you or change you in the future. Now, I do want to specifically call out number 5, so life events, and what we oftentimes will call the distance traveled. And for schools that are very dedicated to holistic review, distance traveled is vitally important because it helps us to understand how far someone had to go or how much they had to overcome to get to where they are now. You can have 2 students. I remember recently reading an application of a student who was homeless for 3 to 4 years, living out of their car, going to college, did fairly well on the MCAT and then applied to med school. And I remember looking at that applicant's application, comparing it to another student who had, again, very similar attributes, very similar MCAT and other metrics. But I looked at how far that homeless student had to come in order to get to that same point. And that's what we mean by distance traveled. And I specifically call that out because each and every one of you, and specifically those who are applying during this application cycle, will have a very unique context and a very unique distance travel because of the pandemic. And that needs to be appreciated, and it is appreciated by the admissions committees, but you also need to communicate that as well. Because whether you realize it or not, this is having a dramatic impact on you. It is having an impact on everyone, don't get me wrong, everyone who's applying, but the way it will impact individuals will vary. And we even see that from a medical standpoint. For instance, if we look at the disparities that are playing out across the country in different communities based on region, based on the demographics, race, ethnicity, et cetera, of individuals in that community, we see that the pandemic, the COVID-19, is having a differential impact. And that's what we want to understand. We want to understand, again, how that has impacted you. So just to go back and revisit what we talked about as far as that model, that rubric. Again, at the center is excellence. Schools determine excellence based on your metrics, but it's more than just the usual metrics. We try to put the metrics into the context of your attributes, but because you are an individual, we have to put the metrics and attributes in the context of your life experiences. Now, at the end of the day, we need your help to put all this together, because you are putting the information, the data points in, and we are doing our best to cull through those data points to understand your context, to understand your story. But to the degree that you're able to give us some help and to frame it with your own voice, we are would be so appreciative. And what I mean by that is we all have a story, we all have a narrative. And that narrative is best told through the voice of the person who experienced it or lived it. And what we don't want to do is to infer more than is appropriate. And you have a lot of opportunities to share your story, your narrative, or to tie everything together. Definitely your personal statement is an opportunity. Your secondary statements are an opportunity. I will, just as a side, really encourage you not just to cut and paste from your personal statement into your secondaries. I really encourage you to put the time and energy into the secondary, because that's the opportunity for the school to ask you very specific questions which align with the school's mission, vision, and values. And if we see that someone hasn't put the thought into it, one, we don't get to know that person as well as we would hope, but then it also shows that they may not know us as well as we would hope. and therefore that they aren't putting the time and the energy into it. But as far as your personal statement is concerned, again, this is another resource you can find on the MC website. In general, it has 4 main components, and this isn't necessarily linear, but your personal statement tells us a bit about, and we will hope that you would tell us a bit about your motivation to go into this work. Now, in many ways, your motivation harkens back to your experiences, right? So it could be your formative life experiences that, you were ill, a family member was ill. I mean, of course, we all know that many of us have those sorts of stories, but then also all those other experiences that you've had that continued to refine your understanding of what it means to be a physician, continue to propel you forward. So why did you choose that school? Why did you choose that leadership experience, that scholarly experience? How did that change you again? And how did that continue to motivate you forward? Your personal statement should tell us a bit about your fit. So what is it about you that makes you a good fit for this field? Is it that you're empathetic? Is it that you're compassionate? Is it that you're inquisitive, etc.? And what is it about this field that is a good fit for you? So meaning not just wanting to help people isn't enough, right? You could be a social worker or case manager and help people. You could be a community advocate and help people. Being a physician is a very unique constellation of being an educator, being a clinician, and oftentimes as well being a scholar. And you have to understand sort of that constellation to then understand why it's a fit. So again, in many ways, the fit piece goes back to your attributes. So what is it about who you are and the values that you bring to the table that make you a good fit for this field? Your personal statement should also tell us a bit about your capacity. So how do we know that you have the capacity to do this work? Again, in many ways, this ties back to the issue of your metrics. So meaning that if you are phenomenal across the board, you have excellent MCATs and GPAs, you can very explicitly, or it will be very explicit that you have the capacity to do the work. But what if you did struggle? And what if your MCAT isn't what you would hope, or your GPA isn't what you would hope? This is your opportunity to provide additional context. So if you had a family member who passed during your sophomore, your junior year, if you had a illness that impacted your ability to do well on the MCAT, so this is your ability to provide that context. Or if you had to do a post-bac program, you are able to provide that narrative, that story, to give us that additional insight. And then finally, your personal statement should tell us a bit about your vision. So how would you use this opportunity, this incredible opportunity that not everyone has, to realize your vision for yourself, but then also your vision for how you want to change the world? And this is your opportunity to be aspirational. We want to really understand what makes you different. How are you going to impact the world that in a way that someone else may not be able to? So I believe you all will learn a bit more about personal statement writing a little bit later, but I wanted to provide that framework, particularly as it relates to your story. Again, you can see that storytelling really is a vital part of the way I think, and the way many, I would say, believe that you should approach your personal statement. And part of the reason for that is storytelling is a vital part of who we are as humans. For much of our history, humans have passed on our history, our context through our stories. And even from a neuroscience standpoint, when we tell stories and we listen to the stories of others, it actually helps us. There's a part of our brain that mirrors the thinking of the other person. And that's what helps us to mitigate our biases, to broaden our in-group and decrease our out-group. So we as humans are hardwired to listen to stories and want to communicate our stories. Now, I do want to be cognizant of time, and we have around 19 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we have time to review some questions that you may have. But I want to just briefly share a bit about my story to illustrate how we all have an arc. and how that arc might be communicated in your application or within your CV down the road. And very briefly, I'm from a small city outside of Chicago called Gary, Indiana. If you want to imagine Gary, Indiana, imagine the south side of Chicago and everything you've heard about it, pick it up and move it 20 miles to the east and compress it into a city a fourth of the size, and that's Gary, Indiana. Gary is one of the most, or that part of the country, Northwest Indiana, is one of the most segregated parts of the country. Gary is around 80 to 90% Black. It's surrounded by communities which are around 80% white. It's one of the most impoverished parts of the country. It has one of the highest teen pregnancy rates, one of the highest high school attrition rates. And that is the context in which I was born. I was born in 1981. And throughout my formative years, definitely into the 1990s, Gary was the murder capital of the country. And I saw the impact that the surrounding environment had on my family, but importantly had on my cohort of students. So I started high school with well over 400 students. By the time we graduated, we only had around 220 students left. Out of that 220 students, only 20 of us went on to college that I know of. Out of that 20, only 5 or so of us graduated from college. And to my knowledge, I'm the only one who went on to graduate school beyond that. And I did so as a first generation student, but then also as a teen parent. So my first child was born shortly after I turned 18 during my first month of college. And I went on to college with this, again, context. I went down to Florida A&M University, FAMU, a historically Black college in Tallahassee, not understanding and knowing how disadvantaged I was. And I didn't realize that fact until I got down to FAMU and got my first test back. My first test was in general chemistry. It was a typical weed out course. And I got an F. It was the first F of my life. Now, that's not to say that I shouldn't have gotten an F before. It's just that we didn't have any AP classes in high school, so I never had to study. And when I got that F, I was terrified. Not just because I got an F, but because I had no idea what I needed to do in order to get a better grade. I remember calling up my mother, telling her, you know, Mom, I don't think I can do this. I think I'm gonna have to come home. And I remember my mom listened to me for a little while, and then she said, well, I don't know what you're gonna do, but you're not coming home. And then she just hung up the phone on me. Now, don't take that as a representation of my mother's love for me. She actually loves me very much, but she also understands me very well, and she understands my context very well. And she knew that if I came home with a young child with the larger context, the likelihood that I would go back to school was really, really low. And she knew that because we saw that happen so very often in Gary. So after a few days of trying to reach my mom and her not picking up, I knew that I had to make a way for myself. And I remember sitting there looking across the room at my roommate. I got an F on that test, he got a D. And we at that time made a bond with one another. We made a pact with one another that we were going to help each other through this because we saw that we were in very similar situations. And we said that we were going to help each other to learn how to learn how to study. And that's exactly what we did. Over the next few weeks, we drilled each other, we pushed one another, and slowly we saw that it started to make a difference. The next test I got a C, the next test I got a B, the next test I got an A. I ended up finishing up that quarter with 3 A's and 3 B's. The next quarter I got all A's and a B. And that was actually the last B I ever got throughout undergrad and even into med school. Now, I tell you that because that experience was pivotal for me and for my life, because it made me appreciate the concept of mutual accountability and mutual responsibility. It made me appreciate that if one of us fails, we all fail, but if we band together, it made me appreciate that we can lift everyone up. And that's exactly what I started to do. So even though I was thriving, I saw that many of my classmates at FAMU weren't. And I started forming study groups, and then those study groups became student organizations. Those student organizations became pathway programs and pipeline programs. And that ultimately became the arc or the story for my career. That extended into my time at the University of Chicago for med school, where I went on to direct one of the pipeline programs there, the one that ultimately became the SHEPET program. It extended on to my time as a chief resident, my time in fellowship, and now as the Associate Dean for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity for a major new medical school. In many ways, my story has come full circle, where I'm now in a position to directly impact others who are coming through that pipeline or that pathway. And I would say that if you looked at all the details in between there, if you looked at my CV or looked at my application, from the leadership experiences I took on to the scholarly activity, the research activity that I was a part of, you can see the story, you can see the arc, you can see how where I'm from right now doesn't live in isolation from where I came from. Where I go from here, you can infer, you can understand that that won't live in isolation from what I do now. So that's what I mean by the story, and that's what I mean by the arc. So I'm going to very briefly tell you about the Kaiser Permanente story, and specifically the efforts that we are putting in place to make sure that we live up to our dedication to EIND, specifically with regard to admissions. Given the time, I'm going to skip over some of the initial history, but we'll just briefly state the Kaiser Permanente isn't one thing. We're actually a lot of different things. We are Kaiser, which is the health plan and the hospital started by Henry J. Kaiser, and Permanente, which are the medical groups started by Dr. Sidney Garfield. And from our inception back in the 1950s, the concept of equity, inclusion, and diversity was core to our organization, even before there were words to speak to that. So we were one of the first hospital systems to desegregate our hospitals in the 1940s. We, through the 2000s, leveraged our electronic medical record to eliminate healthcare disparities within our system. And now we are focusing a lot on the issues related to total health or the social determinants of health, recognizing that educational opportunity specifically is so vitally important. In truth, that's one of the reasons why we decided to start our own medical school. Recognizing, though, that this isn't something that's completely new for us. We've had residency and fellowship programs since the 1940s to 1950s. We actually already serve as a clinical training site for thousands of medical students. More than half of all UCLA students, for instance, rotate through our hospitals. So it's really only the first 2 years of medical school that we haven't historically done. And we thought that this was now the time for us to do it because we recognize that things need to change. The current model of medical education, which has been in place for more than a century, there's a lot of good out of it. I'm a product of that system, but we recognize that there's a lot that needs to change. From the rising cost of medical education to the issues related to depression, burnout, and suicidality, to the lack of diversity in medical school. These are things that we thought that as an entity, we could impact, and we thought that these are, this would be one way for us to try to move medical education in a positive direction. So to that end, our vision is that our graduates will be a diverse community of healers, but importantly of leaders. If you had to ask me the one thing that we're looking for leadership. Because we will only train 48 students per year, but our goal is actually to train 48 leaders per year. We want these individuals to come with us, train with us for 4 or so years, and then to leave, to go out from the Kaiser Permanente system to places where we aren't, to New York, to Illinois, to Florida, to Virginia, to become leaders in the systems that they join and to change those systems for the better. And we can do that because we are a separate legal entity from the rest of Kaiser Permanente. So there is no obligation to pay back service to our school. We are here to support, and we are here to be a catalyst for change. One of the ways that we're going to do that is by making sure that equity, inclusion, and diversity is threaded throughout our entire curriculum and or throughout our entire school. And I think that that's especially highlighted in our approach to admissions. Here you can see our admissions requirements and our recommended courses. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but I will highlight that these requirements or prerequisites aren't very different from that of other schools, but we are specifically trying to call out something and communicate something to you as applicants, that we do value the behavioral and social sciences. We value the humanities. we value cultural humility. And that's why we list language other than English under our recommended courses. And that could be Spanish, it can be Vietnamese, it could be American Sign Language. What we're trying to communicate to you is that having a perspective outside of your own narrow perspective is important, and being culturally humble and culturally sensitive to others is important. But in general, not different from, very different from that of other schools. But what is different for us are our application requirements. And I will specifically call out that aside from this current cycle, which is being impacted by COVID-19, we have made it our vow, our dedication, that we won't set up cutoffs for our MCAT or GPAs. I want to be very explicit in saying that that does not mean that we don't believe that the MCAT and GPA aren't important. They're clearly very important. It's just that we recognize that if we set up cutoffs for our MCAT and GPA, the computer system would weed out students, and we would never get the chance to see their application, get the chance to put their applications into context. So by not having cutoffs, it allows us to view every application that comes to us. We got more than 10,000 applications this past cycle, and we literally looked through everyone. A real person looked through every application to try to find individuals that may have that lower MCAT and GPA, but they may be lower socioeconomic status, and maybe they had to work 2 to 3 jobs throughout undergrad to support themselves and their family. Well, that person has already shown that they're resilient, that they're persistent, and we would have reason to believe that if we put them in a different context with free tuition, with academic coaching, that that person may thrive. So that's why we don't have cutoffs. I'll also point out here that we highly encourage our DACA students to apply, and we believe that we have the resources to support those students. And we have the resources to, one, understand their context and make sure that they have what they need to be successful and thrive. Now, finally, I want to talk about this particular cycle that's being impacted by COVID-19. And I want to communicate to you that we have made it our stance that we will accept pass-fail grades without prejudice for courses taken during the COVID-19 pandemic. So meaning that if your school was impacted and you had to switch to virtual courses, and as a consequence, they were unable to award letter grades, we are going to accept pass-fail grades. We have also made it our dedication this cycle that we will offer interviews for individuals who were unable to take the MCAT due to COVID-19 related test cancellations. Now, we will make the determination for interviews based on other aspects of the application. But again, it gets back to my earlier point of the importance of the story and understanding the context. So you really have to make sure that you work on and build out those other parts of your application. Now, importantly, though, if MCAT testing resumes prior to October, when many of the decisions, acceptance decisions will be made, students will be required, applicants will be required to take the MCAT before an admissions decision is made. Now, accordingly, and this is the important point, and if you take nothing away from this presentation, we are highly encouraging students to still apply early. Now, in general, those who are underrepresented in medicine tend to apply later in the cycle anyway, which in of itself, from a statistical standpoint, reduces the likelihood that they will get interviews. So in general, you should apply early, but definitely in this situation, this is a very special opportunity, I think, particularly in light of the current context. You should not delay your application, have it ready, make sure you submit it on time. I will also say that many other California schools are taking a very similar stance, and actually the California schools are trying their best to coordinate their efforts in that regard. We anticipate that many other schools across the country will take a very similar approach, but you need to reach out to individual schools to understand how they're approaching the issue of COVID-19 and the impact it's having. And then finally, from a financial support standpoint with regard to our school, because we want to recognize the importance of context and that so many students the current cost of medical school is placing medical education out of reach for so many students, we have made it our dedication that every student in the first 5 cohorts of our school will receive 100% free tuition, as well as coverage of their medical insurance and a very generous stipend to offset living expenses in Southern California. And specifically for students that are impacted by COVID-19 who are accepted to our school, we are also giving them resources to ease the burden of COVID-19 and specifically to help in their transition. Now, this isn't a marketing ploy from Kaiser Permanente. This is because we are very passionate, very concerned about the issue of educational debt. And our goal is to make this dedication indefinite. So that's a lot of information. I, again, know we are running low on time, but I want to thank you for your patience. Thank you for your interest. And now I want to open things up to questions. I'm not quite sure how we are going to take the questions, but I think Lauren can help us to navigate that. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Conwell. I will go ahead and if you just have a few minutes to answer some of the questions that we have here. I see some of them coming in with some very common themes. I think the students would really appreciate hearing your opinion on these questions. If you like, I can go ahead and pick them out of the Q&A and go ahead and ask them to you.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So I'm seeing a lot of people who are really worried about the MCAT. And you mentioned how a student shouldn't delay their application just because they haven't taken the MCAT yet. Do you have any opinion on when it's too late to take an MCAT in terms of the application cycle?
That's a great question. And again, I highly, highly encourage students to reach out to the individual schools that they are applying to this cycle to understand how schools are going to pivot related to COVID-19. Outside of this cycle, outside of COVID-19, in general, most schools, our school included, would not review the application until your MCAT has posted. So that is an important distinction outside of the cycle. So for that reason, it is important to make sure that you plan out your MCAT testing so that your MCAT is available as early in the cycle as possible. And again, this is purely a statistical issue. So meaning most schools will have a rolling interview process. So at the beginning of the interview cycle, the first day of the interview cycle, let's say a hypothetical school has 100 interview slots and 50 students who have applied. So it's much easier for those 50 students to get an interview at that time. Even a month into the interview cycle, and definitely by midpoint of the interview cycle, you will have a fraction of those interview slots left, maybe just 25 interview slots. But the number of people who are applying has quadrupled. So statistically, it's actually much harder to get an interview later on in the cycle. So so to answer the question, there's no one date within the cycle that I can say is the cutoff, but just statistically, the earlier in the cycle you apply, the earlier in the cycle that your MCAT is ready, the better off you are. But again, you should take the MCAT when you are most prepared to take it. And that harkens back to my other comment, that if you haven't taken all your coursework, if you haven't finished studying for the MCAT, if you on your practice tests are scoring really low, I would say you aren't in a good position at that point to do as well on the MCAT. And this is, again, where your mentors can be helpful.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for elaborating on that a little bit more. And kind of building off of that, a lot of students are saying with everything going on with COVID, their application timelines have shifted a little bit. And there's been talk about some schools extending the deadline for their primary application submissions. Does that affect anything in terms of rolling admissions? Do you think that those who are forced to apply a little bit later will be at a disadvantage to those who are applying earlier, even though the length of the application process has extended slightly?
Yeah, so it's a great point. So again, this application cycle is different from every other application cycle. And I would say that you are right. We are getting information from our admissions office that the primary application will be delayed. I think it's going to be delayed by a month or so. And that's going to, as far as when we receive the application. So that's going to have a downstream ripple effect. But everything will likely shift as a consequence. So again, stay up to date with the WMC, with AMCUS as far as those changes. But importantly, we can't make blanket statements for every medical school. So you need to reach out to individual medical schools and understand the processes that they're putting in place at their med school. Because I would hate for anyone to assume that something is going to be the case across the board, and then they miss out on opportunities because of those assumptions.
Right, perfect. And we'll go ahead and make this kind of our last loaded question for you. I see a lot of students who are really excited by Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine, and a lot of them are really intrigued and unsure about the school because of how new it is. Do you mind just giving a quick spiel for all of the interested students on the type of degree that you guys grant and what your courses are like and what student life looks like at the School of Medicine?
Absolutely, and I will do a pretty quick fly through by encourage you, well, one, definitely reach out to us, but specifically, please go to our med school website where you can learn more information. There's a great fly through of our video and actually of our building. Our building is complete, is beautiful. Our school has a dedication to wellness, and you will see that highlighted very clearly in our building. We are located in Pasadena, California. We chose the location again because of the opportunity for wellness activities, specifically as we think about going outdoors once we are able to go outdoors again. As far as our leadership, so the individuals who are building out the school, I will say that, again, they reflect the diversity that we hope to see in our class, and importantly, the diversity that we have within the communities that we serve. And these individuals, this isn't just a Kaiser Permanente thing. So the School of Medicine, even though it's within the context of Kaiser Permanente, we have pulled from the best and brightest minds across the country. Our leadership really represent a diversity of experience that then allows us to beautifully marry traditional academics with the innovation that is Kaiser Permanente. Our educational approach, I will tell you, is going to be more than the traditional approach. So the traditional approach is, segmented courses in anatomy, embryology, etc. Our approach is integrated from the beginning. You come in on Monday, you meet patients, you work in your team of 6 to 8 students with 2 preceptors per student. So that's a student and teacher ratio of 1 to 4. To unravel parts of the case. So from the biomedical to the clinical to the health systems part of the case. And this is all done within the context of innovation and technology. So meaning you meet your patient on Monday, you learn a bit about their context and how their zip code really does determine more about their health than their genetic code. On Tuesday, you do an exam on your patient. So using handheld ultrasound and other modalities. If you find that there's something wrong, you get to go to the anatomy lab. But it's a multimodal anatomy lab using CT, MRI, plastinated human cadavers, but then also using augmented and virtual reality. You get to put on the AR, VR helmet, reach inside of the patient, pull out their heart, pull it apart to see where the arteries, the veins, etc. are running. On Wednesday, now that you know that there's something wrong with the patient, you can learn more about the physiology and the pathophysiology of that patient. But on Thursday, starting in your first month of school, instead of coming to class, you actually go to your primary care clinic. You're paired one-on-one with the primary care preceptor, taking care of a subset of their patients, and you stay in that clinic for 2 years. During your second year, you also get the opportunity to start an OB-GYN clinic, pediatrics clinic, psych and surgery clinic. And then once per month, instead of going to your primary care clinic, you go to FQHC, a federally qualified healthcare center outside of Kaiser Permanente, where you learn from community advocates and learn from social workers how to do community needs assessments, and then how to partner with the community to meet those needs. We also, and that's called service learning, which is a vital part of our curriculum. You also will have a coach. So every student will have a physician who's trained to be their coach to help them from a wellness standpoint as well as from an academic standpoint. And then finally, you have opportunities to pursue your passion no matter where it takes you. So we have a dual degree MD PhD program with Caltech, MD Masters in Health Systems Engineering with Loyola Marymount. You can get your MPH with UCLA or your MHA with USC. So again, no matter what you're interested in, our goal is to make you a leader regardless of your passion. So that's, I would say, the 20,000-foot overview of the school.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us Dr. Conwell, it was so great to meet you and learn a little bit about Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine. I know that I definitely have learned a lot about the program and love everything that you guys are doing. And thank you to all of you who tuned in and attended this webinar. I just want to remind you all that we're going to be back next Wednesday at the same time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, to go ahead and cover a couple different things. I know a lot of you have a lot of questions about the work and activity section, how to fill it out, how to go about approaching your descriptions, and also little details about filling out the AMCAS application. So I will be walking you all through that. And we'll also talk a little bit about the finances of applying to medical school and how to budget. So thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to come back next week and go ahead and send us any questions if you have them before our next webinar. And we look forward to seeing you all. Hope you guys have a great night.
Bye, everyone.